Good afternoon, everyone. For those people who don't know who I am, my name's Louise Giolito. I'm the CEO of the WA Council of Social Service. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners in the land in which we meet, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I also note this always was and always will be. This land has never been ceded. And thank you everyone for joining us online today. We've got an all-star lineup, and I'm not going to go through and introduce everyone and their bios because I think that'll take up most of the session. So, but I get the pleasure of actually kicking off today's session, Emerging Issues 2021. The community service sector has experienced no shortage of challenges over the past 12 months. The public health and economic impacts of COVID-19 continue to take centre stage, yet there is transpiring against a backdrop of more frequent and more severe natural disaster. And there's been an extraordinary run of events on the top of COVID and the occasional lockdown we've had here in WA. We've had Woolloomooloo bushfires and Cyclone Seroja. This is painting a sobering picture of the new normal, of escalating and compounding crisis. We as a sector know that compounding crises expose the vulnerability of those already struggling in our communities, as well as tipping others into vulnerability and disadvantage. Many West Australians are experiencing financial vulnerabilities, hardship and bill stress for the very first time in their lives as the cost of living continues to increase while government coronavirus support measures have ceased, such as the rental moratorium and the increase in income support. This is reflected in the increasing demand for services in areas of concern across our state, including housing, homelessness, food relief, mental health, child protection, and of course, family and domestic violence, which is a plague on this country that never seems to be diminishing. The economic impacts of COVID-19 drive and exacerbate social impacts and are typically most severe for individuals and groups living in entrenched disadvantage. The impact on community services will be significant if we are to meet the predicted increase in demand. And this is a community service sector that's already stretched to its limits. This is all taking place with a broader context of social and political change. In the new state parliament, the WA Labor Party has secured a second term with an unparalleled win. It's almost impossible to see any other colour but red in Parliament House at the moment. With the opposition numbers so reduced, the role of civil society has never been more important. We have a duty to ensure this government is delivering on its commitments and pushing for structural reform and public policy outcomes that will need to make our state a lot better, and especially for those who are most vulnerable in our community. On a state level, we've had a gender-blind economic recovery strategies. Federally, they've produced some limited gender policies. However, these won't support the poorest and most vulnerable women in our communities. And revelations of revelations of sexual harassment and violence in the federal parliament have sparked louder calls for gender equity and for building cultures of respect, responsibility and equality. It is truly an unprecedented context we find ourselves. It is difficult to narrow down the topics for this year's Emerging Issues Forum. Today, we have a panel of experts providing a forward-looking view on poverty and inequality, housing, gender equity, strategic engagement with the state and federal government. There are, of course, many other ongoing social justice issues that we could have covered today, but we simply didn't have time. And they were issues such as providing targeted support to increase the number of children growing up in poverty, our growing pandemic of people with mental health issues, identification of potential strategic changes to address the ongoing climate crisis. So much is needed to be done in closing the gap and seeing the objectives of the Uluru Statement from the Heart realised. I'm sure there are many others among many others we could have discussed today, so we can truly build back and leave no one left behind. Today we were going to talk about WACOSS's campaign, but we're not. I just want to touch on campaigns that are actually out there and happening at the moment. And many of you will be aware of them, such as Raise the Rate. Whilst we haven't seen the significant increase in income support for those who are most vulnerable in our communities. Raise the Rate has had a great deal of success in engaging and bringing along the general public to actually support, and the non-usual suspects such as the Governor of the Reserve Bank and many economists all agree that the income support needed to be raised considerably. We've got WAM's Prevent, Support, Heal around mental health and how that's impacting everyone in the community. Shelter WA's Unlock Housing, and the media coverage they're getting at the moment is quite outstanding, because housing is an issue for everyone in our community and absolutely a basic need. And of course, we have Clean State sort of working on, we need better policies in relation to the environment. We all recognise we need to get broader public support to actually make a difference, and especially with this state government. Without broader public support, the impact we're going to have is quite limited. WACOSS is just starting on this journey. And of course, our space is in social justice and poverty. First up, we absolutely firmly believe that the broader public and the broader community have to believe that poverty is actually an issue in our community. Many don't actually realise the impact and what that actually looks like in someone's home and in a child's life. So that will be the area that we're working on. I'm very proud to say the WACOSS board has actually put financial support, and it's a long-term campaign. It's not like 1 week or 2 weeks or a year. They've put money behind it for several years about raising the awareness around poverty and how it actually manifests in our community. In addition, we'll be going out and we'll be meeting within communities and working out how do we build that army of people to get behind us and support us in that campaign. So please stay tuned. But of course, we will always be sort of backing, you know, ACOSS, Shelter WA and WAM and many other important campaigns that are out there, because we know, for example, poverty has a huge impact on people's mental health. The people most in crisis in housing, of course, are the people on our lowest income. So we will continue to work with the other peaks in this space. That's enough from me. It's now my pleasure to introduce and hand over to our first speaker, Chris Toomey, the leader of policy and research at WACOSS. Chris will provide a forecast on policy and inequality in conjunction to his role at WACOSS. Chris is also a senior industry fellow at the Bankwest Curtin Economic Centre. Chris, I'm not going to ring out your bio because everybody knows who you are. So over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Louise. And just a reminder to everyone that you can enter any questions using the Q&A function at any time in the chat there, and we'll get to them later. I'd like to start by saying Kaya Nala Karich Nungamort Kain Karak Nijabuja, just acknowledging the land on which we meet. Poverty and inequality are not emerging issues for us as such. They've been our core business for many years. But despite our shared commitment, we continue to struggle to get traction with our calls for a fairer and more inclusive community. However, 2020 was a year like no other, and COVID really shook things up. The nature of hardship changed for many, and we saw some fundamental shifts in community attitudes and in our national political debate. So today, I want to start a conversation about these emerging opportunities and challenges and ask, how can we change the way we work on these issues to have a greater impact? Can we go to the next slide, thanks? Talking poverty isn't getting us very far. We need to recognise that the language of poverty does not work with the mainstream community. It makes sense to those who care and are already engaged, but it doesn't cut through with the wider population, blocked by stereotypes of the undeserving poor and an idea that real poverty is somehow something that happens overseas. So we need to make it real and personal and connected. Much of the best work in this space focuses on the language of fairness. It's based on real life stories of those who are struggling through no fault of their own and deserve an opportunity to live a decent life and to provide for their families. This is where the work supporting those with lived experience to share their stories and develop their skills as an effective advocates comes in, like we've seen with 100 Families and the Raise the Rate campaign. The other thing that really cuts through is the plight of children growing up in poverty, and it is hard to blame them for their circumstances. And the argument that they should have a chance to grow up safe and healthy, to thrive and to develop to their full potential carries a lot of weight. So going forward, we need to be more strategic and sustained to focus where our efforts result in measurable shifts in community attitudes. Next slide, please. By and large, the Australian community took to heart the message, "We're all in this together, let's leave no one behind." Attitudes to poverty and social support shifted fundamentally. As a result, we saw Scotty from marketing was forced to drop 2 decades of the debt and deficit disaster narrative and follow where community values led, committing billions in crisis response and stimulus measures, including 90 billion for Jobkeeper, and effectively doubling the rate of New Starter allowance rebadged as Jobseeker, at least for a while anyway. What this showed the community is that poverty in our community has always been a political choice and not the economic necessity it's often been sold to us as. We could choose to lift people out of poverty if we wanted to. And we saw as a stimulus measure, it was highly effective because any increase to those on the lowest incomes got spent immediately in their local communities on essential goods and services, boosting local economic activity and helping keep others employed. The case studies coming from our sector have shown the immense difference a small increase in income made to the lives of those living in poverty. We saw them making decisions, sensible decisions, to buy healthy food, pay down debt, and invest in those things that would make the biggest difference to their quality of life, to their capacity to secure work and care for their families. However, we also saw some very strange spending decisions coming from those at the top. Childcare was free for a brief period of time, once they realised shutting childcare would take out a large chunk of our crisis workforce. But then childcare workers became the first to be cut out of Jobkeeper, a reflection of the political power of for-profit providers with their workforce on mostly short-term contracts. And then what we saw with the gendered nature of the stimulus measures was mind-boggling. While the evidence clearly showed it was women and young people who'd lost the most jobs, the stimulus spending was targeted to male-dominated industry. And now WA seems destined to play out its third boom and bust cycle in 3 decades as resources and construction face skilled worker shortages. Next slide. And then Canberra was rocked by the latest, we're one deck of slides behind. One more slide forward, please. I'm sorry, I couldn't see that behind my script. Then Canberra was rocked by the latest, no, one back now, please, sorry. Oh, somehow my slides are out of order. Okay, go back one, please. The women one. Okay, thank you. Then Canberra was rocked by the latest and most public of a series of scandals, with Brittany Higgins exposing the toxic sexual culture in Parliament House. We reached another tipping point in the public consciousness. Violence against women was front and centre in the national debate. Scotty from marketing needed to respond. However, no one was convinced by the great bag of photo ops and jumbled tokenism we saw in the so-called women's budget. However, what the women's budget has done is shift the discussion about fairness and women's place in our economy. It opened the door for us to advocate that state and federal budgets need to address women's wellbeing and be measured against it. In recent weeks, we've seen Victoria has put out a gender equity budget framework and announced creation of a gender responsive budget unit in Treasury. Now it's time that we saw Western Australia doing the same thing. When we start measuring budget outcomes for women's health and wellbeing, this should lead to a fundamental shift in how we design, value, and measure public services. It gives teeth to our advocacy for pay equity in WA, but it also creates the foundations to recognise the true value of care work, so we can focus our investments in those places that make the biggest difference to the most people in the long term. I also want to talk for a minute about the politics of early education and care. While it is not only women who benefit the most from access to quality childcare, it does make a bigger difference to their wellbeing and capacity to work. The recent childcare package clearly targeted middle-income families with lots of kids. While in the longer term, this may lead to more childcare places, the big risk is in the short term that developmentally vulnerable kids from low-income households will be displaced. So when we talk about early education and care, there are 2 complementary benefits. One is the economic benefits of freeing up women's capacity to work. The other is about early childhood development. and that is the area in the longest term that has the biggest impact on well-being and the growth of our economy. Childcare policy nationally continues to be framed as about women's workforce participation and miss the need of children at risk. The budget measures fail to address the barriers faced by single mums in accessing childcare so that they can then secure and maintain work. Okay, onto the wellbeing slide. There is an emerging global alliance of civil society organisations and governments who are collectively advancing the shift towards a wellbeing economy. Their common focus is how we can best measure and advance human and ecological well-being. This new economics seeks to measure what matters, to track real value and meaningful progress, not to simply just count dollars. 5 governments have already begun implementing wellbeing budgeting frameworks, with Canada the latest to sign up. The ACT recently put in place a wellbeing framework and will deliver their first wellbeing budget this year. Meanwhile, the Victorian Treasurer told the WACOSS budget breakfast late last year they are also looking into wellbeing, and they've put in place a Gender Equality Act, Gender Responsive Budget Unit, and a Gender Budget Statement. So I'll skip forward to the end now. Next one. I've placed a few key sources there. In closing, community attitudes have shifted substantially during the COVID crisis. Issues around fairness and opportunity are now on the political agenda. We've proven the value of investing in those facing hardship as a way of making our economy more effective, inclusive, and resilient. Gender equity, sexual violence, and the unfair treatment of women are now at the forefront of our national consciousness, and there is pressure to change our political culture. We have an opportunity now to build on these trends to help shift this concern to commitment and then on to action. We can leverage global and domestic initiatives to push for a wellbeing framework here, to recognise the true value of care work and measure how investment in early development and in equal opportunities deliver a more inclusive, productive and resilient economy. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Stephen Rowley, who is providing a snapshot on housing affordability and the emerging crisis in low-income affordable rental. Stephen is a Professor of Property in the School of Economics, Finance and Property at Curtin University. He has been a Director of Uhuri's Curtin Research Centre since 2011, and he's made a major contribution to housing research, particularly around affordability and affordable housing supply. Over to you, Stephen.
Thanks, Chris. Hello, everybody. Just another reminder to put any questions you may have in the chat. So if we can put in that presentation, please. I'll just start with the a few issues that I wanted to comment on today. So obviously housing is absolutely critical to household well-being, and the media are all over the current rental crisis at the moment. It's not a day goes by before you wake up and see various stories about problems in the private rental market. So I wanted to concentrate on the private rental market because I'm not too concerned about ownership at the moment. Yes, prices are rising, but we're still relatively affordable, and there's plenty of incentives, and certainly have been, for people trying to get into home ownership. But really the private rental sector and the bottom end of that private rental sector is a real problem at the moment. There's a real lack of available housing. So REWA estimate there's about 2,800 rental properties available to rent in the state. That's half as many as this time last year. And I guess it's no surprise that rents have increased by about 15% in the last year or so. And renters are extremely vulnerable to increases in rent. And previous survey work we've done, looking at maybe almost 50% of renters are going to have a major impact on their well-being if you have a 10% increase in rent. Now, we've been pretty fortunate over the last few years because rents have been static and in fact falling for many people. So we have been through a really nice sort of stable period in the rental markets and significant positives in terms of affordability. But that's certainly coming to an end now, as I say, big increases in rent recently and likely to continue going forward until we see an increase in supply. And when you get a shortage of rentals and the vacancy rate now is less than 1%, you get a lot of competition there. And the problem with the private rental market is you do get moderate household income households competing with low income households and generally winning the battle because landlords think they've got greater capacity to pay. So it is those people at the lower end of the income spectrum that are really struggling to secure those affordable rentals, hence a lot of the stories that we've seen. And also when there's a shortage, you tend to get issues of discrimination as well, with people making the decisions based around who they want to rent to, and the ones that are affected and ones that are discriminated against tend to be one parent households, tend to be Indigenous groups. And so they find it even more difficult to get into that rental sector. And of course, we have a lack of a safety net. There's so little social housing out there. If you can't access affordable quality rental housing, where else do you go? Unless you've got family and friends willing to accommodate you, there really are very few options available. And that's why the private rental sector is so important for low-income households. Go to the next slide, please. So here just puts in perspective just how much of a shortage of social housing we really have in Australia and Western Australia compared to other states, other countries. UK probably the most comparable, but they're over three times the amount of social housing that we have in this state. So that shortage is a real problem, and we don't have that safety net, as I mentioned before, to really house people that are struggling in that private rental sector. Next slide, please. So we did a bit of research last year. We did a survey of 15,000 private renters across the country during sort of hopefully we're nearly at the end of COVID, but given what's happening in Melbourne, probably not. But certainly we were allowed to get a snapshot of what COVID had done to the rental market and generally to what's happening in that private rental market. And what normally comes out of private rental research is those barriers to ownership. So people want to get out of private rental market generally, although a lot of people do like that flexibility, but there is that desire to go into ownership, and that deposit gap is the big barrier to ownership, and the lack of income as well, not being able to afford anything. And what we do see in the private rental market is people are forced to move quite often. Some people choose to move, of course, to take up employment opportunities to a more suitable dwelling. But it's finding almost a third of renters have moved 3 or more times in 5 years. It's a real problem in terms of stability, particularly if you've got children. And during COVID, so almost 1 in 5 people drew on their superannuation to help cover housing costs. And obviously that has major implications going forward. And the little graph there to the left, bottom left to the side, it's a useful measure of just how households are struggling in the private rental market. Housing stress is not, in my view, a particularly useful measure. Asking people about their money, their ability to meet expenditure after paying housing costs is quite frankly more useful because it takes into account their specific circumstances. So you can see there, you've got only half of renters actually are able to save after paying rent. And you've got almost a third that can't pay for non-essential expenditure, which is a real issue there for struggling households. Just next, please. In terms of affordability, the private rental market is actually doing a pretty decent job. It's providing affordable housing for most. It's around about 10% are struggling in unaffordable, very unaffordable housing. And those are the 10% that we've got to be really concerned about. And if you think about it from a Western Australian perspective, there's about between 250 and 300,000 rental households. So that's 25 to 30,000 households that are in basically housing that they do not find affordable. So that's a real problem in terms of well-being. Next, please. In terms of dwelling satisfaction, again, it's pretty similar. You've got about 10% that are dissatisfied with their dwelling. So again, the private rental market's not doing a bad job generally. Again, it emphasises those on the lowest income that need the support. Next slide, please. What we do have an issue with is housing quality. There's about 1 in 4 people complained about the quality of their housing, particularly issues around electrics, damp, mold, that sort of thing. You can see here that poor quality doesn't mean affordable housing. So you've got almost a quarter of people living in poor quality housing find it unaffordable. So as I said before, crap housing doesn't make it affordable. If we go to the next slide, what we see there is you can be in unaffordable housing and still be satisfied with your dwelling if it's in good condition. Once you've got unaffordable and poor quality housing, that's a recipe for disaster, with 80% of tenants actually dissatisfied with their housing. So while affordability is really important, households can adjust, but you can't adjust to unaffordable, poor quality housing together. Final slide, please. So these are the key issues I see moving forward to try and address some of these issues. We've been building at the lowest rate for 30 years until the home builder stimulus has picked things up a little bit, but we need more supply into that rental market. We need a significant increase in social housing funding to provide that safety net for low-income tenants. We need a subsidised affordable housing rental market, similar to NRAS, where you've got rental housing below market. We need the private sector to deliver affordable housing from market developments. It's interesting that Victoria talking about taxing the windfall gain from uplift, and that's great if you can then direct it into affordable housing and it doesn't disappear into the ether somewhere. Certainly build to rent is often talked about a solution. Well, potentially if you can get some subsidy in there to deliver affordable dwellings, and we definitely need better regulation of the private rental sector to offer more security to low-income tenants. The moratorium is extremely helpful for many households, and we need to make sure that we get rid of no grounds eviction, and we make sure that the private rental sector is a tenure that people feel safe and secure within. So I will leave it there. Happy to take any questions later. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Michelle Mackenzie, who's CEO of Shelter WA, which is the peak body for housing and homelessness. Michelle will talk about Shelter's WA's Unlock Housing campaign. So Michelle became Shelter's CEO at the beginning of 2018. She's a passion for social justice, human rights, and working with people, communities, and institutions to advocate and deliver more affordable and diverse housing choice. She's passionate about working collaboratively, facilitating the alignment of government, industry, researchers, and the community sector to design and deliver an affordable housing system. Prior to working at Shelter WA, Michelle was an executive director at the Department of Regional Development, led the regional community relations team at Rio Tinto, and was an executive manager at the WA Local Government Association. Michelle.
Thanks, Stephen, and thank you so much for your presentation. It's great to follow you. So I've got big shoes to fill. So I'll just share my screen. I can't screen share it same while other participants are sharing their screen. So maybe Team WACOSS, do you need to share the screen for me? No, here we go. So I'll just pop this on slideshow, she says confidently. Okay. How's that? Maybe a thumbs up from you, Stephen, if it's working. Great. All right. Firstly, thank you, Team WACOSS, for letting me participate in today's forum. I've been asked to speak about the Unlock Housing campaign. So for those that don't know, Shelter WA ran the Unlock Housing campaign phase 1 pre-election. We, in the pre-election environment, had 3 pretty simple asks. We were calling on all candidates to invest in social and affordable housing, to fix the housing system, and to end homelessness. And Stephen has outlined why. In terms of the investment, we had a package where we wanted increased investment in social housing and affordable rental products. We wanted climate-ready homes. We wanted government to audit their land. We wanted government to look at how they could partner with the community housing sector to deliver more supply. In terms of the housing system, it was pretty simple: reform the Residential Tenancy Act, reform stamp duty and land taxes, and ending homelessness. We wanted to build and accelerate the government's commitment and pace of change in terms of Housing First initiatives. So we're really thrilled to run the campaign. In terms of the package, it was a $4 year investment package. We know that housing creates jobs, and we know, as Stephen said, that housing is pretty fundamental. So it would deliver a whole lot of other government policy priorities. Were we successful? Yes, we were, in terms of a coalition of people wanting to drive investment in housing amongst the sector and amongst the community. We had heat maps, we did community perception surveys. We know the community they really care about social and affordable housing investment. The only bad thing was we didn't get any pre-election housing commitments, but certainly Labor had some pre-election commitments in the homelessness space. And here's an example of what they have promised to deliver over the next term of government. And that was on top of their previous commitments of 2 common ground facilities, Housing First, homelessness initiatives, and then 3 packages, Metronet, Housing Investment Package and SHIRT, which will deliver 870 new social homes. So post-election, there's been some significant things that have changed. As Professor Rowley said, we've got a complete housing market that's nuts at the moment. Supply and demand is all out of whack if you're on the lower end of the market. No affordable rentals, social housing wait list of 16,000 households. We've got a new minister. We've met with him. He is very committed and wants to refocus the government agenda onto social housing, which is fantastic. Despite being no housing commitments, we know that there's a 2-month whole of government task force looking at the best way to deliver social housing and how to pay for it. That's a real opportunity, I think, in a pre-budget environment. And of course, we've got a new DG, and they're setting up a new housing and homeless strategy unit. They're looking at working with us on what policy reforms needed to really drive the growth of the community housing sector. And as I said, there's 870 new social homes that will be built. Okay, now government policy, housing touches many areas, not just the Department of Communities. We know that the commercial operations are shifting to Development WA. That's an opportunity, I think, to use some of their inclusionary zoning policies to see if we can increase supply. Metronet, flagship Labor policy, they want to activate those TODs. You've got an industry who says, well, maybe it's not in terms of risk and reward. Great for us to invest around those Metronet precincts. So how can our sector work with government to de-risk the markets in those Metronet precincts? Planning, we've got a 45% infill target, a missing middle of homes. Housing can deliver that. And as Louise said earlier, housing health agenda, mental health agenda, climate change is a real opportunity for us to use housing to drive all of government policies. We've got a fantastic community housing sector, and I think with the Development WA, who's housing neutral in terms of who they can partner with, that could provide an opportunity. I've mentioned industry risk and reward. We've got a supply chain that's geared towards different the products that we get now. How do we get climate change? How do we get smaller, more affordable homes and more social housing in partnership with industry? And as I said, we did some perception surveys in the pre-election environment. Community expectations are shifting around climate, around housing, around products, location and cost. And there's an opportunity at a pre-budget to think about that. As I said, there were a number of pre-election Labor commitments around homelessness. The community does care. I think COVID has shown that people understand the importance of home, and a bit more of an outrage that people are experiencing homelessness, and not blaming people for that, but understanding it's a housing issue. We've got a homelessness strategy with a roadmap for reform. We've got a fantastic services sector that needs sustainable funding. There's an opportunity to invest in the sector and look at how we can better procure and commission contracts. We know the government's got a focus on closing the gap, Aboriginal empowerment and the Aboriginal community controlled sector. We know that we've got housing first, but there's no housing. So there's an opportunity in a pre-election and a pre-budget environment to think about if the government really wants to drive the housing first agenda, which is absolutely supported across the sector, you need homes. Also, local governments playing more of a role in homelessness. How do we harness them and harness their strengths? And lived experience is really critical if we're going to have a homelessness services system that meets the needs of service users. So post-election, there's quite a lot of emerging issues, some not that emerging, they've been around for a while, but how do we bundle that all together when we've got a state budget? So Stephen also mentioned the pressures in the private rental market. Part of the Unlock Housing package was around reform of the Residential Tenancy Act. 1/3 of people in WA rent. We've got a new Minister for Commerce. We've met with her. We're hoping that the Residential Tenancy Act reform will be accelerated. So with the issues that Stephen raised, Shelter in partnership with WACOSS and YACWA, other peaks, and some of the services that provide private tenancy support, we can't wait. We do have a housing emergency. So the housing emergency response group was established, and pretty simple. We need to keep people in their homes now and ensure that everybody has a home. The Housing Emergency Response Group's been driving quite a lot of the commentary in the media to raise the issue of the impact of poor housing on people in Western Australia. And we've got 4 simple asks. We want the housing emergency to be treated like an emergency welfare response that you'd have if there were a bushfire or a flood. We need surety of emergency relief funding. We do not want anyone to have to leave their rental home because they can't afford it. The government's been great with the residential relief grant scheme, providing support, but too many people are falling between the cracks. And also we know that there's vacant homes out there. There are options to use lazy government land and modular construction to immediately bring homes to the market. We know there are vacant apartments. We need to actually get people who have to leave their rental home into homes straight away. And we look forward to a joint meeting with the ministers who have accountability around this to talk about that emergency response. The HERG will continue, and now while that's going on, we're casting our eyes to phase 2 of the Unlock Housing campaign, which is swinging into a pre-budget campaign. So our strategy, we want to support the new minister and his intent to get more investment into social and affordable rental housing, and we want to be solution focused. As I said, the McGowan government did some good things in the previous term, but we want to accelerate and build on those initiatives. We can't wait. And so in terms of our tactics, we're working inside the tent. We're providing information to the Department of Communities, to ministerial staff. We're talking with backbenchers. We're talking with central agencies. We're doing economic modelling. We're providing government with all of the solutions that our sector does well and knows that we can do. And then outside the tent, we're going to have continued media pressure. We're not taking our foot off this metal. We know that housing is a mainstream issue. We know services are seeing people that have never come in contact with charities before, and we need to convince the government that it's okay to spend their $5 billion surplus into housing. And so our whole aim is that we have more investment in social and affordable housing and homelessness services in the state budget. It's really tight, so we know that the agencies are working on their budget bids now. So we're meeting with Treasury again next week. We've been talking endlessly with the Department of Communities. We have been providing with solutions to Minister Carey, to Minister McGurk. We're meeting with Minister Booty this week, and we are looking forward to that budget being a housing budget. Please get involved with our campaign. Please, you can sign up and be a campaign partner. I won't go through all of this, but please just go on the Unlock Housing website. We'd love to have you involved. And if your name isn't up there, it means you're not a signed up campaign partner, and I'd encourage you to sign up now. So that's my presentation. Housing is an emerging issue, and we hope that you can work with us, with WACOSS, with YACWA, with all of the other fantastic peaks to let this government know that housing is an issue that is worth investing in. Okay, so I'm just going to open up my iPad and introduce the next speaker. Here we go. Sorry about this, it's a wee bit slow.
Michelle, do you want to take down your shared screen?
Sure.
Thank you.
Let me see if I can, Louise. A simple request. Right. Stop share. There we go. Perfect. Right, now I've got the pleasure of introducing Professor Rebecca Cassells, the Deputy Director at the Bankwest Curtin Economic Centre. And Rebecca will be providing an outlook on gender equality in our workplaces, our institutions and our homes. So just some background on Rebecca. Rebecca has been working at the intersection of academia and public policy for almost 20 years and has led major research projects for federal and state government departments, industry bodies and not-for-profit organisations. Her research focuses on labour markets and economic and social issues that encompasses aspects of gender equity, poverty and disadvantage. Rebecca has provided evidence to the parliamentary inquiries on the economic security for women in retirement, childcare availability and affordability, and the Productivity Commission's investigation into the childcare workforce and geographic mobility. So congrats. I'd like to introduce Rebecca, and over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks so much for that. And thanks, Louise and Chris, for inviting me here today. I'm going to talk about an issue that's taken up most of my research career in life, and something I'm incredibly passionate about, which is gender equality, and looking at the current state of gender equality in our workplaces, in our homes, and in our institutions. And as Chris mentioned in the opening, and Louise as well, that this is an issue that's really come to the fore recently. First of all, during COVID, but also because of the really the quite significant political backlash that have happened in the federal space lately. And I'm actually quite pleased to see that there has been some action taken in the last federal budget that says that they are listening. I wanted to start off just to remind us all by what we mean by gender equality and how this definition interrelates with gender equity. I often get asked what the difference is between the two, and if we move to the next slide, I've got this little kind of piece that pieces them together, I guess. This is from UNESCO. So when we talk about gender equality, it doesn't mean exactly the same thing for women and men, but let's hope we can get to the same outcomes. So it means that women and men have the same rights, the same responsibilities and the opportunities, and whatever they can get to does not depend on whether they were born male or female. Gender equity, on the other hand, means fairness of treatment for men and women according to their respective needs. And this might include equal treatment or treatment that is different, but which is considered equivalent in terms of rights, benefits, obligations, and opportunities. And that's a definition from the United Nations. So equality is the end goal and equity is the means to get there. So next slide, where is Australia when it comes to gender equality? Well, globally, we are actually slipping, and we've slipped quite tremendously according to the latest rankings from the World Economic Forum Global Gender Gap Index. Australia is now ranked 50th out of 156 countries, and we've fallen 6 places between 2020 and 2021, so just over a 12-month period. But we've fallen 35 places between 2006 and 2021. New Zealand is now ranked 4th, behind Iceland, Finland, and Norway, of course, the leading countries when it comes to gender equality. But New Zealand is now ranked 4th, and I think that's really an important sign. And Chris mentioned earlier the wellbeing approach that they have to policy and to budgeting. And I think there's no, it'd be quite clear that there is a distinct link between that political approach and the outcome that they've been able to achieve. We do have parity. Men and women in general, broadly speaking, have parity in health and education. We do quite well there, but obviously there are issues when we take into account intersectionality, and if we looked a little further, the outcomes for education and health are not the same for Indigenous women and men, nor for people of a culturally and linguistic diverse background, people with a disability, and people from low socioeconomic areas. But in general, broadly speaking, our health and education outcomes are pretty good. But political and economic empowerment are lacking, and they are lacking big time. We are slipping, and this is the reason that we have slipped in this global index. You can see that here in Western Australia, we are actually doing a little better when it comes to political empowerment. It's improved since the last election, and we've almost reached parity for the Legislative Assembly, but we still have some way to go for the Legislative Council. I think it's important to note that this is unlikely to have happened if there wasn't an affirmative action plan embedded in the Labor Party for a very long time, and we can see that nationally as well. Liberal Party and other parties don't necessarily have this type of affirmative action, and therefore if they're not concentrating on this or targeting this as an outcome, they are not going to get there. We know from our research that targets work. You need to actually set them to achieve them. They are not going to happen miraculously or by some type of merit that may or may not exist. So if you target an outcome, you will receive an outcome, and I think it's a great feat that Western Australia has achieved to have almost parity in the Legislative Assembly, and wouldn't it be great to see that translate into some really targeted and really well thought out gender equality outcomes for Western Australia. Moving on now to look at what I really want to focus in on today, which is the persistent economic participation and opportunity issues that we're falling behind on it. And these stretch across the economy, and they have been with us for a very, very long time. And COVID has really shone a brighter light on these issues. Employment gaps are still a constant feature. Women are less likely to participate in the labour market, around 10 percentage points less than men. And if they do participate, they'll be more than likely to work part-time. Of all of the part-time jobs at the moment, women are holding 70% of those part-time jobs. So it's a significant gap, and it compromises lifetime earnings. And obviously the earnings are linked, go hand in hand with what you can achieve in terms of superannuation, and then what your future economic security is going to look like. So this is a big problem, how the difference between women and men and how they participate. And it's not something that's actually changing very fast. And there's lots of barriers preventing that participation. And one of them is the unequal share of unpaid work. Women are still doing the absolute lion's share of unpaid work. Around 75% of all unpaid work in our economy is done by women. And this is caring for kids, caring for the elderly, the sick, the disabled, managing households and housework, volunteer work. And this, of course, was exacerbated during COVID. Industry and occupational segregation, that is also a permanent feature of our workforce, and it has been with us for a very, very long time. Men tend to work with men, women tend to work with women, and we're not seeing that shifting very, very much at all. These do drive poor outcomes for women in particular, and we see that there's a consistent theme of a devaluation of the roles that women occupy, particularly in the care workforce. This is seen through both wage outcomes, but also the level of prestige that these occupations attract. If women tend to start dominating or concentrating in a particular role, it's just not seen as valuable as when men do. And there's some really interesting studies showing that over a very long period of time. Conscious and unconscious bias, so it's everywhere, it's ingrained, it's a feature of our homes, it's a feature of our workplaces. It constrains women's and men's opportunities and outcomes. And obviously sexual harassment is still incredibly problematic, but I'm so pleased to see that actually come to the fore as well, and that we are hopefully going to start dealing with these problems a little bit better than what we have in the past. There are significant leadership gaps across our workforces, with men more likely to be in a senior leader position than women. These gaps are closing, and I think this is a really positive sign, and it shows the gains that women are making to a degree in the workforce. But for some positions, they're just completely glacial, and for CEOs in particular, if we continued on with the current pace of women entering into those positions, we actually wouldn't see parity in these roles until next century. So they're a long, long way off, and there's something very special or something reserved about these positions. Obviously, there's some sort of discrimination or bias that says that a man is really the best placed person for these senior leadership positions. And the gender pay gap, well, it is a permanent feature of the workplace. It has been closing nationally. It's actually now down to around 13.9% if we look at average weekly earnings. But here in Western Australia, it's huge. And there are drivers here, but these drivers still matter, and men are still earning significant amount more than women here in Western Australia. And that wage gap really isn't shifting at all. We move to the next slide. If we see this current rate of change that is positive when it comes to the gender pay gap, it's still likely to take at least another quarter of a century to eliminate this pay gap. So that is some time, another 25 years, another generation to actually close the full-time gender pay gap. For executives, the gender pay gap may disappear in the next decade, but the outlook is less positive for community and personal service workers. sales workers and technicians and trades. And the current patterns show that there's no end in sight. In fact, it's indefinite, because there hasn't been any substantial change over the last 5, 10 plus years. If the average rate of change continues, the gender pay gap among full-time executives would be eliminated within 10 years, and for senior managers in less than 15 years. But for those non-management occupations, it's very hard to see anything too bright in the future of these wage gaps narrowing at all. We do know, though, from our work with the Workplace Gender Equality Agency data, and this data is really powerful because it's longitudinal and it tracks the same organisations over time, and it has 4 million workers within this data set. We know from this data that if organisations pay close attention to workplace gender equality practices, if they are consistent, if they are annually undertaking a gender pay gap audit, they are constantly updating their policies around recruitment and remuneration, that this actually does lead to better outcomes in the future, lower gender pay gaps and more women in senior leadership ranks. But if we move to the next slide, we can see that it's actually the male-dominated sectors that are doing better and have made the biggest improvements over time. If we move to the next slide, please. Thank you. Oh, Chris is saying I'm out of time. I'm winding up, Chris. This is the second last slide. Really what I wanted to showcase here is that male-dominated sectors are more likely to be paying closer attention to gender equity good practice, and it's the healthcare and social assistance and the education and training sectors that are not doing enough, and these sectors need to pay more attention. We'll skip the next slide and just go to the key take-homes from today. And to the next slide. So the key take-homes really are that gender equality is an objective within our reach, absolutely, but it takes consistent and comprehensive attention from our political leaders and institutions and from within our workplaces. Economic and political outcomes are particularly worse for women, and Australia is slipping behind the rest of the world. And female-dominated sectors really, in particular, could be doing more to achieve better equality in their organisations. So it's now my pleasure to hand over to Tania Cecconi, who's an absolute advocate and expert in what it takes to achieve gender equity in our businesses and in our workplaces. Tania is the Executive Director at CEOs for Gender Equity, and Tania is going to provide an overview of strategy and advocacy in advancing gender equitable outcomes in workplaces. Tania.
Thanks, Beck. Thanks for that. Thank you, Louise, Jenny and Chris for having me here today. Yeah, really delighted to come off the back of what Beck shared with us. Next, thanks. In terms of the work that I do in heading up CEOs for Gender Equity, our vision is to boost workforce participation, lift productivity and increase economic growth by sustainably improving gender equity in jobs and pay. We know that better balance in workforces leads to productivity gains and economic growth. There's a strong business case for it, and the BCEC proved that unequivocally last year for the first time globally to demonstrate that there is a causal gap between women's participation in higher levels and increases to the bottom line. We work differently to most other organisations who advocate in this space, in as much that we engage CEOs because we acknowledge that the workplace is an opportunity to effect real change for women, as well as acknowledging that change starts at the top. We don't fix women. We don't ask women to break the glass ceiling. We don't ask them to ask for a pay rise to fix the gender gap. We don't ask women to play the game, man up, or think like a man. We don't ask women to overcome the barriers, particularly if the barriers are systemic. We don't ask women to blame themselves. We definitely don't ask them to blame other women nor men, because we appreciate the gender balance and workplace gender equity isn't a women's issue, but rather it's a business issue. We don't wait for society to change before we ever take action at work. In acknowledging, I think, COVID as well, I want to accept that much has been made of the royalties and the riches that we enjoy WA that has supported the nation's recovery by and large, but I also want to acknowledge the strength of the health and the social care sector as part of our infrastructure that also supported the recovery. We had women, of course, mostly dominating teaching, childcare, nursing and health, who played a real big role. Good to see that the last federal budget paid some tribute to that, but certainly I'd like to see more. Thank you. Next. In terms of the work that we do, in terms of some of the emerging themes, I see that there's a big backlash against feminism, but feminism has brought us a long, long way. In 1969, we first had equal pay for equal work legislated. Women first got the vote in WA in 1899. Aboriginal women didn't get the vote until 1962. In 1966, we saw the ban lifted on women working in the Commonwealth public sector. So a lot has been achieved. In terms of the emerging issues, like I said, I do see a big backlash against feminism. And again, to Beck's point about the definition of and the difference between equality and equity, feminism is about equal opportunity for men and for women. So it doesn't make sense for us to reject it at such a wholesale level. And I'm not saying us in terms of the audience, but there is certainly a rejection of it I see in the mainstream media. One of the other emerging themes that I see as well is that this focus on women makes many, many organisations and people feel uncomfortable. So we tend to over-dilute it with broader D&I initiatives. Women represent 50% of the population. Diversity and inclusion is not to the exclusion of focusing on women, but rather it's often used to dilute the debate or the topic, if you'd like, to make others feel more comfortable. I also see that there's a huge commodification of programs that focus on fixing women. I've yet to see the return on investment on these programs. Nevertheless, there's an important role that we can all play. And at the end of the day, we certainly focus on what workplaces can do. The next slide, please. I'd like to talk to WA workplaces taking action. And the data that I've got here is derived from the Workplace Gender Equality Agency, the same data set that the BCEC uses, but mine is just based on WA data. So I want to show how far WA has come. WA, over the last 5 years, in WA, we've seen a huge jump in the number of organisations do a gender pay gap audit for the first time. We've gone from 101 organisations in 2016 to 177 organisations undertake a gender pay gap analysis. Beck is absolutely right. When leaders take action by doing a pay gap audit and then reporting it to the exec and to the board, we see a close in that gender pay gap. The issue here in WA is that of the organisations undertaking a gender pay gap audit, the sample size in 2020 was 381. So we still have just over half of WA organisations undertaking a gender pay gap audit. In 2016, the sample size of the 101 organisations that did a gender pay gap audit for the first time was 431. So we don't have huge numbers here in WA of undertaking a gender pay gap audit for the first time. WA indeed does have the highest gender pay gap, but I'll talk a bit more to that. But at the end of the day, of the 60 organisations in WA who are health and social sector organisations, only 16 did a gender pay gap audit. That 16 represents 26% of the health and social care sector in WA. We need more than 1 in 4 organisations in health and social care to undertake a gender pay gap audit for the first time. There are many organisations in WA who flat out refuse to undertake a gender pay gap audit. Having said that, moving on in terms of domestic violence strategy adoptions, we've seen a lot more organisations over the last 5 years adopt a family and domestic violence strategy for the workplace. We've seen movement in flexible work, and we've seen organisations also adopt a gender equity strategy as well. What's really interesting is in the bottom right hand corner, we've seen a 28% increase in the number of female CEOs in WA, a 12% increase in female directors, and only a 5% increase in female managers over the last 5 years. Thank you. Sorry, next slide, thanks. What I spend a lot of time doing in terms of our work and our advocacy, I like to call out the real gender equity gap. And what I talk about the real gender equity gap is the difference between, or the gap between, what our leaders profess to do, speaking externally and promoting what they do externally, versus actually what goes on internally. And I use this model, the leadership shadow, if you like, to close that gap. Now, this leadership shadow is a framework that I use that is not a prescription for automatic success, but it's a practical tool to help analyse what leaders have been doing, to evaluate what's been working and what's not been working, and to adopt more effective actions for moving forward. Now, the 4 quadrants, telling stories, role modelling, building commitment, and creating system change, is about how we turn our mind to congruence, and how the stories we tell are congruent or reinforced by how we walk the talk, how we hold others to account, and how we take specific actions via our systems to improve gender balance, all by identifying our blind spots. Now, the first part, the telling the stories, is about recognising how CEOs talk to and recognise the imbalance in their workforce. They don't like to, they're not the ones who say, oh, well, it's about diversity and all inclusion. Absolutely it is, but these are the CEOs who recognise that there is an imbalance at the top of men and women, and certainly at all levels of their workforce. They assume responsibility, and they also recognise that their experience in terms of getting to the top could well be different to that of others. They don't blame society, and they don't blame other extraneous factors. And they recognise that there are many internal levers to pull before they accept any defeat around achieving better gender balance and gender equity. They also have a really compelling business case for gender equity. Yes, it's the right thing to do, but they understand the difference it would make to their business in terms of the stories that are told within, but also how decisions are made, how leadership is affected, and also how decisions and thinking is different to how perhaps it might have been before. They also have a personal why as to why this is really important to them. In terms of role modelling, they also walk the talk. They acknowledge flexibility, and by all means, they might enjoy some flexibility themselves. They also acknowledge sexual harassment is a real pernicious feature potentially of their workforce. They also recognise that they are in a position to call out sexual harassment, whether it's via their systems or what they tolerate in terms of the workplace. They also acknowledge that, particularly in aged care and in the social services sector, where you're dealing with clients all the time, that their staff can be at risk more so than in other sectors. They also like to build top team commitment by calling out the right and the not so right behaviours. And this is more than just celebrating men taking paid parental leave. This is about calling out behaviours that perhaps aren't consistent with the values of the business, particularly when they're looking to recruit more women into senior roles. Women will typically vote with their feet and leave a business if they can see there's an inconsistency at the top. The other thing that good leaders and progressive leaders do in this space is they create real system change. And what I mean by this, they undertake a gender pay gap audit. They don't say, we do enough for women because we employ them. We're dominated by women in our business. There's 90% of my workforce are women. They still do a gender pay gap audit. They also have policies in place, like most good organisations do, but they also have metrics in place to measure the uptake and the application of those policies and its acceptance. They also pay the superannuation guarantee on paid parental leave. It also means that they dispense with the arbitrary primary and secondary carer definitions for paid parental leave. It also means that they procure with a gender sensitive lens. One particular aged care CEO with whom I was dealing had just completed a big build of an independent living centre. The first time that CEO met a woman from ideation and design to the completion of that project was when a woman was invited in to choose the colour of the carpets.
Tania, I'm really sorry, we're running out of time.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm going to ask you to wind.
Okay, so next. So can we just quickly just bust the gender pay gap myth? So Beck talked about the gender pay gap. These are the national figures. To your right, you can see the gender pay gap for each of the different industries. Here I've got the bottom 3 industries and I've got the top 3 industries with the highest gender pay gap. Mining's in the middle. Health care and social assistance have one of the highest gender pay gaps because even though the sector is dominated by women, you are still paying men more on average than you are women within your own sector. That could be men in senior roles. It could be men in grounds roles, in groundskeeping roles as gardeners. Time and again, I hear of men who are recruited into the healthcare and social assistance sector at higher levels than women. And not necessarily with discrete special skills either, but somehow his experience is valued more than others. So just can we click onto the busting the gender pay gap myth? So this is something that you can easily find on my website that I'd encourage you to go to. I can make sure that it's sent to each of you, but here the gender pay gap myth, this sheet busts the myth that in fact the pay gap has naught to do with mining, and certainly it can't be attributed to why WA has the highest gender pay gap. I just want to make the link between the fact that WA does indeed have the highest gender pay gap, but also it has the lowest uptake of organisations doing a gender pay gap audit. Where can you start? I'll be asking each of you to check to see that in fact your organisation does do a gender pay gap audit. Thank you.
Yeah. Hi, our next, Tania, to introduce the next speaker was Megan, but I'm happy to actually do that. Our next speaker is Megan, founder of Hardwired Corporate Strategy and registered political lobbyist. Megan will be giving an overview of what the recent changes to the state government mean and how to maximise the new political context the sector is now operating in. Over to you, Megan.
Thank you so much. And first of all, I do quickly want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that I'm on, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and pay respects to elders past and present. I do want to give a shout out to all First Nations people participating today, wherever you might be in our great big state. So the aim of today for me is to try and give you a bit of context quickly, but then to get onto some ideas. And my slides are quite busy, but I'm not going to speak to each individual item. I've got a task of making up a bit of time. So if I'm speaking quickly, that's why. And so let's cast our minds back to the election, but I actually want to give you a quick snapshot of what was going on in Labor Party Central in late 2019. There'd been a disastrous federal election for the Labor Party. The State Secretary had resigned. There was an economic recession that was 2 or more quarters with negative growth. Labor was set to lose some seats, with everyone expecting there'd be a correction from what was then an historic landslide win in 2017. Okay, it's kind of hard to remember back that far, I know, with all that's happened, but here on this slide, I'm showing you what was going on just before the election this year. Now, there's good news and bad news, I think, for the sector on this, that the difficulty, of course, in terms of where the government sits and how vulnerable it might perceive itself to be is that, of course, it has had an absolute landslide victory in both houses of parliament. I've just given you those quotes on the left there because this is consistently what we found in terms of what people were saying about why they were going to vote Labor, and the results show that so many did because many of them, of course, had never voted Labor in their life. So on the sort of good news side, though, the other column, these are the issues taken from very large samples of voters polled on the weekend before, or a few days before the election. And I think what's so important there to recognise is that many of the issues that you in the sector are dealing with on a daily basis, but also with the various campaigns that we've heard about today and that we will all know exist, these are actually all issues that are top of mind for many, many voters. And I do want to say, I do want to acknowledge all the hard work done by everybody in the sector, WACOSS and all the other peak bodies. I noticed that there are declining numbers of volunteers being reported, and certainly it's a challenging time. But I think we should bear in mind what these issues are here. Next slide, please. So campaigning, some things don't change. Campaigning, lobbying is all about simply working out who the decision makers are, finding ways to influence them, and often the decision makers you might think are the most important are not necessarily. So you have to do that audit of who's making decisions. The goal, of course, is to influence those decision makers, and sometimes it's actually not something you can best do yourselves or your own organisations. And I'm very much going to talk about the need to enlist the help of other influencers, and they can be very diverse. First of all, though, those basic principles that have not dated. Backbenchers are your best lobbyists, and that because, one, they're free, and secondly, they have incredible access to the decision makers in the Parliament and elsewhere. Ministers have to take lots of time with backbenchers. There's no choice about that. And then I think the rest of those matters speak for themselves, but I do encourage you to remember that ministers as well have to be in their electorate offices on most Fridays, and that's a good time for approaches to be made by you or your own constituencies. So in terms of the fresh approaches that I want to speak to, I think that if we hark back to those issues that were uppermost in many voters' minds ahead of the election, although COVID came along and changed so much, the reality is that we are now seeing the sort of coalescing of so many of those issues with an increase in poverty and so forth. And we've talked about housing with other speakers as per Shelter's campaign. So what I'm going to suggest we could try to do is to firstly look at the social services sector as an industry in the same way as some of the other industries have been so successful. If you think of the housing industry and the various forms of stimulus it's had, quite possibly the number of jobs that have been put to the government are actually way less than what all of your WACOSS members and other people working in the social services would add up to. So that sort of obsession that sometimes politicians can have with numbers, it's very important to be able to capture the huge number of employees that are working in the social services sector now. With the Casino Royal Commission, we kept seeing an emphasis from the Premier on jobs affected by the casino. Well, start to be capturing those sorts of numbers. And I know that that Unions WA with their new permanent secretary and Owen Whittle and others are already well known to the sector. So I'm encouraging you to look at ways to bring in even broader coalitions than you may have already done with industry and so forth. So next slide, please. So the first quote there, sometimes solutions are not more dollars, but about doing things better. Obviously, I can't see whether any of you have got ideas about who said that, but that's the Premier. Premier McGowan has said this repeatedly. I've heard him say it twice in the last week. So it is important to talk about solutions, but it's also important to be able to outline those quite fully. So I think that it's very important to consider whether some of the government policies that have kind of been dropped in the COVID times, service priority review, which I know the sector put a lot of work into, our priorities targets policy, whether those ought to be resurrected or not. I've just given some few other ideas of how you can best have contact with politicians, but I also encourage you to set your own events that are actually targeted at influencing decision makers, as well as informing your traditional constituencies and members. Billionaires and other wealthy people, there's no doubt that they do seem to have a lot of influence with not only this government, but many others. So the concept of fresh approaches to campaigns, I realise that you're all probably doing many of these fresh approaches on an almost daily basis, but the anti-coal seam gas New South Wales example from the early 90s, the intervention in that of Alan Jones at a time, I guess, when he was seen as very pro-mining and so forth, that campaign and his intervention sticks in my mind because at one point he kept talking about the prime agricultural soil being so fertile that you could actually eat it. But having said that, his intervention and alliance with the Greens and a whole range of other grassroots organisations, many of whom still exist in various forms in this state, seem to be able to swing the debate, and there's still a prohibition on BTEX chemicals being used in New South Wales now. So I give that as an example of sometimes unlikely alliances can have fairly strong results. In terms of digital campaigning, I am not an expert on this, but certainly Facebook advertising was one of the key goals used, was one of the key uses by the State Labor Party, and it was incredibly, when coupled with data analytics, was incredibly successful. We've heard a lot about gender equity, but there is clearly emphasis can be placed on ways of engaging more fully on that. So protests I'm all for, but only if there's a way of harnessing all the people that are at those protests and then successfully gathering those energies for the next step. So next slide, please. So I've already touched on a number of these things. There are a lot of celebrities in Western Australia right now for obvious COVID reasons, and I think we're fast becoming the safe haven for people from Los Angeles and other places as well. So sometimes those interventions, they might not seem important, but they do seem to capture politicians' attention. So on the COVID-19 side of things, we've got, of course, a massive skills shortage here. There's a skills summit on the 30th of June, which Louise tells me WACOSS are participating in, and I'm sure a number of your other members will be, or coalition peak bodies will be participating in too. But I do think that that provides a strong opportunity to be showcasing what Western Australia could look like if some of that $5 billion surplus is spent on making Western Australia the premier state in our country for all of the social services and education and health provision that would make it more attractive for people to move to Western Australia. And so given that there are so many private sector companies that are absolutely scrambling to fill employment roles, jobs, then it's probably a really good time to be pitching some of that to them as well. So I did want to also just talk quickly about data analytics, because with that $5 billion surplus, what I think we'd all like to see is better means testing of any sort of general stimulus measures. And in talking to the Treasury, senior Treasury official of WA recently, I was told that one of the main reasons that can't occur is because data, economic data, just doesn't exist for the State Treasury to be able to be more targeted with some of those measures. So that too is maybe something that's worth looking at. Next slide and final slide. So the budget's actually on the 9th of September. So there's 3 months to go. there's lots of opportunities to engage in the meantime, but I just wanted to suggest that some targeted attendances at some of these events may also be good. And federal election, of course, is a bit of a wild card, with some in Canberra predicting that could be as early as the 9th of October. So thank you very much for this opportunity today. I would now like to introduce Edwina MacDonald, and she is the Deputy CEO and Director of Policy and Advocacy at WACOSS, the national peak for the community sector. And she's going to provide an update on the key advocacy responses to the recent federal budget.
Thanks, Megan. Okay. I think we're short on time. No need to give me an extensive bio. Thanks, Megan, for your presentation. And I think WACOSS team, you've got some slides there for me as well. I'm coming to you from the East Coast, where the sun is now set on Gadigal country. And as Megan mentioned, I'm here to talk about ACOS's perspective on the federal budget. I want to acknowledge at the outset that First Nations people were locked out of this budget. In the budget lockup, there was only one spot for just one person from an Aboriginal controlled organisation. And we saw a lack of a funding commitment to closing the gap in the budget, to addressing deaths in custody. There was no additional funding for Aboriginal legal services, and Aboriginal family violence prevention legal services continue to be chronically underfunded. There was a commitment to coming back to closing the gap commitments later this year. So that's something we'll be watching closely, and we'll continue to work to back the voices of Aboriginal leaders and organisations calling for urgent action for constitutional change, for changes to the criminal justice system, for co-design, and for funding for specialist services. So yes, we've got the slide here of what we've seen in the budget. With the budget, we were calling for, and it was delivered, we didn't want a budget that was going to bring back austerity. And that was something we had here, and we had a budget that focused on a target of addressing unemployment. But what's critical is, how do we get there? So as you can see here, we've got some critical investments in care services, but we'll need more. We need to know whether these are one-off spends, or are they going to be followed by future cuts? Is this a step towards greater ongoing support? So this is the question at this point. We've seen some welcome investments in aged care and in home care places, investments in childcare, women's safety, and in mental health. And we saw a commitment to the funding equal pay for housing, homelessness, alcohol, and other drug services. So this is something that I know many of you here today have been campaigning hard to secure, and it's absolutely crucial. The work there is not done yet. There's still more work to confirm equal pay for all services, including, for example, migrant services. So we're continuing to get that locked in, as to campaign to get that locked in as well. We also saw a wage subsidy commitment, which is the government investing in 50 local employment programs around the country. So we see this as a seed of hope for an alternative approach to support people at risk of long-term unemployment. But we'll really need to see the detail on this one. So we'll be watching that one closely as well. But we've also seen some really terrible things in this budget. So there's and it hasn't been reported on a lot, but there's this shocking requirement to require migrants to wait 4 years to access any income support at all. This is a $671 million cut to income support. And we know that 45,000 families and 13,000 individuals will be affected by this. It needs to be legislated. So this is one we're committed to continuing to oppose and seek to try and turn that proposal around. We've seen another 144,000 people on Jobseeker who will need to wait longer for support. Jobseeker still only $44 a day, a failure to invest in social housing, and missing in action also is closing the gap, and no action on climate. We've also heard a bit today already about the gender equality focus at the budget, that certainly the government was putting that one front and centre. We saw the reappearance of the women's budget statement and some investment, but we're still far from seeing gender responsive budgeting. What we've seen also is a failure to address our tax, employment and super systems, which are stacked in favour of men. And at the same time, we didn't see anything specifically to support single mothers on low incomes or older women struggling to find paid work and facing homelessness. We put out a gender analysis today on that, which I saw Chris had linked in his slides, and I can pop in the chat as well if you want more info on that. So next slide, sorry. So where did all the big dollars go? So we've heard a lot of commentary about the spending in care services in this budget. And as you can see here, the big spends have been in personal tax cuts and in business tax cuts. Behind that's a long overdue investment in aged care. And when we hear the question, how do we afford to increase Jobseeker? Well, we can see that paltry increase of $25 a week or cut of 50 back in April. That's that green bit. So the relativities of where the money's going here is really important. Next slide, please. And having seen that massive chunk of spending was on tax cuts, it's really important also to recognise that tax cuts don't help the people who need it the most. So despite what you might hear, including from journalists on ABC, that tax cuts, there's something in there for everyone, tax cuts do not benefit everyone. The lowest 30% of households are not benefiting from tax cuts. The next slide, please. Finally, we heard that this budget was also about addressing unemployment, and we certainly care about where jobs are coming from. And the government has justified its investment in infrastructure with reference to employment. But what you can see here is that if you look at your bang for your buck in terms of expenditure, infrastructure jobs will cost about $500,000 per year. Tax cuts are another high cost option, but investing in care services is a much lower cost option for boosting jobs as well as benefiting society. Now, as also we've heard today, we shouldn't be celebrating that childcare jobs only cost $50,000 a job. We certainly need to increase the value of care labour, and we'll continue to advocate for investment in care services as well as for the value of the work. Finally, and I've got the roundup text from Louise, but some final thoughts on where to from here. I think there's a number of key steps: challenging the nasties, particularly that 4-week waiting period for migrants to access income support. We've got a challenge in terms of what will happen with future budgets. We had the Treasury Secretary last week flagging that we can anticipate a $50 billion a year cut to balance the books. So we need to, and that's 5 times the 2014 horror budget. So we need to really oppose the stage 3 tax cuts and continue to make this link between tax cuts and reduction in services. And also we're looking to the election context and the importance of making these issues bite at a local level, particularly around the ongoing urgent need in increased housing and income support. And so with that, I'm going to hand back to WACOSS. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edwina. I especially want to thank Chris, Tania, Edwina, Stephen, Rebecca, Michelle and Megan. Thank you, everyone.